third time at QI, and we want to thank Norman Denzin that hosted this event that started in 2011. This day psychology has become bigger, and we are now part of the General Congress on Friday and Saturday. And so enjoy this afternoon. We have two great keynote speakers, conversation round table, data playgrounds, coffee and cookies. And so have fun, and if you like, join us for dinner at 6:30 Timpani's restaurant. There are signs at the door, and you can find the place. So thank you for coming.
Welcome everybody. I'm going to introduce two people who hardly need that introduction. Kenneth Gergen and Norman Denzin. As we are going to have this dialogue, I would like to invite the people who sit in the back to actually move forward so that we can have more of an intimate setting, if you don't mind, to come forward. There's plenty of seats here. Thanks for doing this. So, I would like to first introduce Norman Denzin, who is a distinguished professor of communication at the University of Illinois. He is, of course, the main organizer of this event, as well as the editor of the Qualitative Inquiry and Cultural Studies Critical Methodologies. He's also the editor, together with Von Lincoln, of the Handbooks of Qualitative Research. His last book was just published recently, which is Performative Autoethnography. And it's a pleasure to have him here, likewise for Kenneth Gergen, who is a senior researcher and professor of psychology at Swarthmore University. He's the president of the Taos Institute, and is one of the leading worldwide figures for social constructionism. He's wrote in 2009 an outstanding book called Relational Psychology, Relational Being, Beyond Self and Community, as well as a very famous book like It's Subject to Self. And his last book, which was published, I remember well, in 2012, which is Playing with Purpose, which is an introduction to autoethnography. So today we're going to have a topic, a conversation, a dialogue around the topic of critical and post-structural psychology, inquiries in psychology. The speakers will dialogue with each other for about 45, 50 minutes. And after that, we'll take questions from the audience for another 20. More or less. So, the first question that we have is about defining the terms. We talk about post-structural and critical inquiry. And we would like to start setting the base for this discussion, for this conversation, by inviting the two of you to talk about what these terms mean for you. So we're not so much looking at it in dictionary-like definitions of the term, but rather what is your perspective on post-structural and critical inquiry? Any of you can start.
By the way, do you want that close together or the post-structural for a while? Because there's different kinds of
They are different,
involved
indeed.
here.
I'll leave it up to you. Please.
I mean, my own preference would be to do some post-structural first,
All right.
and then sort of move into critical, because again, they're not complete dead fellows.
Okay. So let's start with the post-structural then.
All right. There.
Please. Well, this is a pleasure and honor to be here, and I'm really intimidated by the whole project. I prefer to have a text I'm reading from, which I have, but I've decided not to read from. Maybe more regret that I didn't, but that wouldn't be very dialogical in order to do that. So I like the idea of kind of being free-flowing here and going back and forth. And for me, the trajectory from structural to post-structural to critical inquiry is fairly straightforward, but very, very uneven and very complicated. And I come at this discourse through my experience basically at the University of Illinois, and we have a theory unit called the Theory for Criticism and Interpretive Theory. We were a group of faculty who formed in the 70s, from the humanities, English, philosophy, history. I was in sociology at the time. The project was to take on the serious philosophical work that followed World War II and the trajectory from structuralism to post-structuralism to postmodernism. That was one trajectory. Then within each of those phases, Saussure, for example, within language, semiotics, Barthes within language, then Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, the German philosophers. We explored that trajectory. Then we did Marx and Marxism and Gramsci and the British Marxists, and then the way that migrated into the British School of Cultural Studies, the Birmingham School, and how the Birmingham School appropriated a particular view of Gramsci, and how then they worked their way through psychoanalysis, and the Lacanian School, and then hovering all through this was Derrida and the Derridian reading of Husserl, and Derrida's critique of the Husserlian notion of consciousness and a reflexive I, and Levi-Strauss's appropriation of the Husserlian notion of language and the sign as it was put forward by Barthes, by sort of deconstructing the whole idea that there was a stable I or no or a stable sign. So we were in the midst of this was like a 10-year project, but we were heavily into this. Each semester we had a set of reading assignments. Each Monday night or every other Monday night we met and we went through the original text. So it was a wonderful opportunity. By the end of this 5-year period, we were up to date with what was going on in what you might call critical social theory. And it was both a liability and a plus, because now when I look back on that period, it was a wonderful moment to read the originals, and then to sort of be poised today, 20 years later, there's a new cohort, there's a new generation taking up these terms and bringing their meaning to these terms. And what we did in my cohort was to go to the originals, quote, Heidegger, Lacan, Levi-Strauss, Derrida, and then, so our bias today is, well, you can't use these terms until you go back and follow the journey that we followed, which of course is, you want to kill the father so you can go forward. So I'm not sure that is the way to go today. But that's how I did it, and that's how we did it. And so when I use these words, I bring this really complicated reading to them, and I tell my graduate students, theory has to pass through the eye of a needle, by which I mean everything I do is thoroughly saturated in post-structural theorizing. Thoroughly. To the point where I can say I don't need theory. Because I have gone beyond theory by having worked through the trajectory to get to the point where language is completely and always indeterminate. Okay. The idea of a stable identity, of a stable reflexive self, is an image, is an illusion. There is no stable centered identity. The idea that structure is fixed and can be studied carefully because it's in a set of fixed categories, that's an illusion. Structure is an ongoing, complicated, messy process embedded in material reality. So, my project then, there was a link that I then made, and I made 2 steps, and I'll kind of handle it all. So I made a link to performativity and performance theory. And really Art Bachner and Carolyn and Mish Allen were the ones that pointed me in that direction. I was under contract to do a book on narrative ethnography, and I think we had coffee down in Miami after some meetings, and they said, well, you should really read Dwight Conquergood. So, all right. And I had, on my campus, I had Ed Bruder in anthropology, who was a colleague of Victor Turner, who was doing performance, he was following the performance turn in anthropology. Conquergood took me into the performance turn thanks to this lead in communication, and the field that performance was taking through the work of Schechner and then Turner and others into here was the major move. we had gotten to the place where we talked about writing culture. And Bruder had taught me this, that culture is a process. And the Writing Culture book in '86, which was the Clifford and Marcus Bible for us, was all about you don't study culture, you write it, you construct culture through the act of writing. Well, that was a big breakthrough. Okay. But that's an important breakthrough because the author, this opens the space for Carol Leonard's project on autoethnography. If I'm writing culture, if it is written that I am writing myself into the great project of writing the thing I'm writing about. Now, Convergood then takes this one step further for me. He says there's a textual bias in the writing culture project. The Thick Description Project at Geertz says we can write culture thickly in a way that evokes evocatively like the Balinese cockfight. Well, Dwight's move was to say writing itself is a performance. And he said there's a logocentric, this is Derrida, there's a logocentric bias in the writing culture project, thinking you can still write this thing that is in motion, that you are somehow on top of, but part of while you're writing it. Instead, Convergood said, you're performing the very thing you're writing. That's the performance turn for me. And there's more to it, I can come back to that. But if I now, so then my project now is not to write culture in a way that is to be read so much as to write culture in a way that is to be performed and to write performatively. And that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years, trying to do that with these books I've done on the West. On the postmodern West was to write plays that I used as a way to make visible the very thing I was trying to represent, perform, and critique. And then there was the one more move, and this was from Paulo Freire, and from Art Kinslow, and Peter McLaren, a chapter in the handbook on critical inquiry. Joe and Peter took me back to Freire, who said our project is to not just describe, perform culture, but to critique culture and to critique ideology and to write in a way that is a form of resistance and a form of critique. So critical inquiry is more than just being critical of, it's writing in a way that performs a critique of the very phenomenon that which is embedded in language, in ideology, and politics. So the project now becomes inherently political and critical, and then if it's inherently political and critical, it's moral, and then that's where I then find from the Freirean framework a moral political stance to work from. To push, that's what this Congress is all about, to push from a stance of social justice, of equity, to produce work that pushes back against the structures of domination that push us into these spaces that we have been critiquing. That's my
But
input.
this is a wonderful summary. It's a lot for Ken to follow up on. So let me maybe summarize some of the main points that, some of the main reflections that Norman just made. So maybe you can follow up on them for the sake of the dialogue here. So questioning the stable of biographical I. And I suppose this is also part of your project, Ken, as much as I know. Could you follow up on that? I mean, what's your position on this questioning the biographical I?
Let me start back a little bit. One piece missing here that I didn't think ought to be out on the table.
Sure.
Just to kind of collect us a little bit, because this has been a wonderful panorama, and I think it might be helpful to kind of focus in just on the post-structuralist move and what that means for psychology a little bit, and what that means for any kind of qualitative inquiry, and ultimately what it means for theory and what it would mean for stance in the field. And I think we share about 80% of what we were saying. I think we're really on board. I would have some questions about some of it, how far you are people willing to go, and where else are people willing to go.
Right.
Maybe we can get to that. But let me just tell a little piece of an intellectual story that I think would make this clear. I mean, I grew up a psychologist. That's where I was trained. Now, generally, within that field, we take as a reality something we'll call psychological process. So that is, it could be experience, but it could be cognitive, it could be emotional, it could be motivational. You know, the whole range of what we take to be, in some way, the essence of what it is to be human. Like you had a lot of other sort of agendas going on, but that was my profession. And I won't go into it all, but I think where I began to, where it really became complicated for me is in reading Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, which was, again, a part of another agenda. But now, basically, Wittgenstein is a deconstruction of psychology in the sense that if you place the meaning of language within the practice of language itself, it deconstructs the object. Which is to say that we can take a term like I feel, or I want, or I hope, or I dream, that is all these sort of references to psychological process, and say, look, they're parts of language games, parts of forms of life. There's no reference for those, other than that which we may baptize as a reference, but in this case there's nothing thing to baptize, so we just got the speaking of psychology. So when we're doing psychology, there's actually no reference, there's no thing which we're studying, because we've made it all up. Now you can begin to see that psychology begins to unravel as a discipline, because you've just made a fiction and you act as if you're studying it empirically, when all you can do ultimately is play the game of language. Because you can't say anything intelligible about the mind outside of a set of linguistic practices or traditions. I can't say the emotions are green or running in 20-degree angles, because it just doesn't make sense. Or I can't say I wanted to do it, therefore I didn't do it, because again, it just doesn't make sense in our tradition. Now, where this gets to be part of the structuralist debate is that psychology inherited, as did most social science disciplines, something in the way of what you call a structuralist explanation. It's an explanatory form, or you might say a literary trope, where you're given a phenomenon, kind of fluctuating phenomena, and the challenge is to find that which lies behind it, that from which it emerges, that which gives it form. So, and it's a wonderful challenge. So in psychoanalysis, for example, so we have the patient speaking, but behind that there are processes, there are basic processes, and if we could only understand that process, we could understand the phenomenon. And likewise in Marxism, if we could only understand the material conditions, we could understand the full range of what's going on. Or with Chomsky, if we only understood the deep structure of language, we could understand the ephemera of language as it moves, and so on. Now that's, again, it's a trope. It's a way of doing things, often with a kind of idea that there's some sort of master puzzle behind there. We can solve that. And in the same way, might be in philosophy, as we read all the words, but what they mean, as if somehow the writer had some kind of real meaning there. And what we're doing is trying to locate the meaning behind the words, and then we understand. Now, what Wittgenstein does, and this is also done in this whole French literary tradition, ultimately, from Saussure through Derrida, says, look, whatever we do in the way of describe or explain, we're located in a linguistic tradition, which not only renders the search for the underlying inoperable, because there isn't any underlying that you can discover outside of their linguistic tradition, but it begins to render problematic the whole idea of research. I mean, now, post-structuralist critique sort of can go political, because they also could go intellectual. I mean, just in the intellectual form, it raises a lot of hell with anything that attempts to locate the nature of mind, or it begins to raise questions for a lot of people here. What would it be to understand someone's experience? There's a lot of qualitative research is about getting at the experience mind of, let me get at the experience, let me get the narrative that you're experiencing and so on, when all we can say about his experience is already circumscribed by a whole set of literary traditions. So it begins to ask, well, what are we doing whenever we're doing qualitative research, or in fact research of any kind, as if somehow the data could be explained outside of that tradition which we bring to it. Ultimately, and this is with Derrida, it will undermine the very arguments I've been making. Because all attempts to give an explanation in the way I have also rely on the same kinds of traditions. So I'm not really saying anything that you can't, as with Nietzsche, find resting on a mobile army of metaphors or divided into binary structures, of which this is all I can say anyway. So in some sense, in terms of saying anything foundational, really important, what we must know, what we must do, what we must discover, in some sense it's all rhetoric. Now where does that leave us? I mean, I think for a lot of people it's left us in this kind of nihilistic position that, well, what is there to do? There's nothing justifiable because all justification is itself constructed. Well, for me, it kind of goes in several directions, and I won't say all of that now because I think I want to let some of that unfold as things go on. But that nihilism leaves us with ourselves in some sense, because the very attempt to make sense at all, linguistically, and again, if you follow here at Wittgenstein for a moment, if it's in the game, you can't play the game alone. It requires something in a relational, in the way of relational process, to have any meaning at all. And if we live by meanings, even if not justified, it means that the process is prior to the meaning. Even though I can't articulate the process, because in the sense of really telling you what it's like or is, I can only, in some way, evoke it. But it also, for me, is meant trying to put the process of relating as sort of that to which we should give the most care. Not to any individual, not to any cause, but to the process out of which causes and values and life takes form. Okay, so we have to live within these, and I call them prison houses, but you can call them a lot of other things, or these rich potentials we have for generating meaning together, but it means devoting an enormous amount of attention to those processes and sustaining and enriching those processes out of which anything becomes valuable at all for doing. But with a deep humility, because any standpoint, any position, any judgment, is always coming from something and going to be oppressing or undermining that which is not there. That is, the realities we make now are indeed suppressing other realities that are not on the table, and you cannot not do that. So it's sort of co-creating with a sort of a continuous sense of the, not only the ephemera, but the tenuousness and the inability to make that, to sustain that in the face of everything else.
To better understand what you mean by humility, you say humility, you refer to epistemological humility in the sense of what we know, what we can do. Can you say more about that humility you're referring to?
You mean about what?
You said that in order to do this project of deconstructing, we are moving towards a sense of humility?
Well, it's trying to sort of say, look, all we've got is a way of living together, or at least not all we've got, but a lot of what we got, and we're constructing in some form of language. And I don't mean to limit this to verbal spoken language, but that's a good start, because that's where a lot of this thing comes from. So rather than living in that language, trying to make it ultimately real, trying to pin it down, trying to get clear, trying to develop knowledge within its framework, the point is to get, to me, is to pay attention to that process in such a way that these forms that we're continuously developing, in some way don't destroy us, and perhaps we can do better than that.
So it seems to me that a natural, or the next step to what you're saying is the concept of resistance.
Is a concept of
Resistance. Resisting.
resisting. You know, that's
And
another thing
what
that
we
might
just-
value. You see, he's into resistance.
Okay.
I
Perhaps we
mean,
get
yeah,
follow
he
up
said
on
that
that.
we've got to fight against the structures of oppression and so on, and I'm into that. I mean, it's like but I worry about it a little bit. I worry about it a little bit because you've already set up an opposition, which you could sort of envision the endpoint which you'd like to see happen. Can you get there through oppositional work? And that's the thing I labor with. It has to do with the whole critical movement, which I have great affection, but I must say that in my own career, when I've gone up against things, it usually makes the fight worse.
It would be wonderful, I think, for the sake of clarity, to have a specific example about this. But perhaps we can go to that. So maybe if you can think of an example.
Sure.
In the meantime, I would like to know what you, Norman, what your position is about resistance. What is resistance for? And what is resistance to?
My concept it's a Freirean concept, pedagogy of the rest of pedagogy of resistance, is to create, it's the Freirean notion of working in a situation, an empirical situation, and I can underline, I'll put quotes around empirical very specifically, but within a concrete situation. So for example, I've been working in the postmodern West for the last 15 years, trying to interrogate the representations of Native Americans in the West since the pre-Civil War up to the present, and creating a performance text or performance narratives that take up specific instances of the articulation of Indianness and Native Americanness in relationship to the American class structure, the American military, the discovery and the rediscovery of the West, the articulation of Indianness in nature and in national parks, and so forth. And producing tiny little pieces that are written out of official discourse, the official histories of the American West, military documents, popular literature, film, studies, and so forth. Taking the language of the past, the language of history, the official discourse. I take this from Walter Benjamin. You let history speak back to itself by exposing its contradictions, by making it visible, making the contradictions of history visible within the very moment where you bring history up against its own contradictions. That's the purpose, is to create the narrative that brings those contradictions, makes them visible, performatively. Now, it's more than just to make them visible performatively and say, aha, they were racist back then, and they treated Indians really bad. So we knew that going in. The project is to find in a concrete particular moment how that articulation functioned and worked. And then to produce, I get this from Sweeney Madison, who gets it from Dwight Conkergood, who also got it from Freire. which is to imagine a politics of possibility, a utopian set of openings, where the past can be rewritten or reimagined or relived with an alternative ending, where those who were oppressed, those who were annihilated, those who were misrepresented, fight back. They take history in their own hands and rewrite history in terms of a liberatory narrative, a Freirean narrative, which is a pedagogy of resistance. And that text, that narrative is a performance, becomes a performative document that can be both enacted within a classroom, within a particular other kind of setting, in an ethno-drama manner, the way Johnny Saldana does this. That's the way I move it. That's the way I look at it. And I write that in a decentered way in which Ken will say, well, you're sliding around on this. I want to displace my own voice in the narrative and eschew a kind of objective official critic of the past or of culture, but let the critique emerge within the voices inside the narrative. So it's a decentered critique of resistance that articulates, from Sweeney Madison, a politics of possibility. If you take her book on acts of activism, 3 long plays in that book, brilliant book, based on her research, her decade-long research in Africa and Kenya, on water rights, women's rights, and voters' rights. 3 long plays where Sweeney is an interlocutor in this narrative, these narratives around these 3 sites, advancing a politics of possibility, a politics of activism. That's where I move with my students. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to write.
So this project is still based on the assumption that we can properly represent the issue of racism in this case. So that's the link to objectivity that you were referring to. We need to first understand or acknowledge that a particular population was discriminated.
Well, I work from the politics of representation position, that nothing is ever represented accurately. It's represented through a politics of representation. It's represented ideologically, linguistically, in a way that articulates a particular standpoint. So there's no objective representation. Now, but if I can take history and quote history back to itself, or selected versions and voices of history, then I think I can begin to crack that shell that is so hermetically clamped down on the popular so as to lead to only particular kinds of revisions or reenactments. Okay?
Toward the opening of possibilities.
Yes, and it's always coming from the politics of representation.
That's the point.
Yes, that is the breakdown point. That is the rupture. That's the rupture from writing culture. That's the Derridian rupture. That's the Stuart Hall rupture. That there's only a politics of representation. Where do you stand in the politics of representation? Ideologically, interpretively, empirically, documentarily, performatively, where in that space are you? That's what Ken's talking about. Finding a space within that space. I think that's on the period.
All right, let me give you the other side of the coin, because
Does this an answer to you?
Sure, yeah, it did.
part of me finds myself being spoken in you. I mean, it's like I love that whole line you take, and did it to some extent.
Yeah.
But what I find is the limitations of it, and the discomfort of wanting to remain there as the only way I've got to go. I mean, if you want to go back to an example, okay, so back in the 70s, I wrote this article called Social Psychology's History of Race, and it created this big stir, I feel, because it said, look, what we're doing in this field is not cumulative science, it is simply working within a historical framework where there is no accumulation, and every time we speak about that, we are indeed entering into the very process which is going to change the society which we're trying to pin down. Okay. Like, people hated this. Now, I had some really good arguments, and there weren't many good arguments coming back, because nobody thought about it, primarily. Hard to get anybody to even review the article, but nobody read anything.
They still do.
So what they end up doing is simply closing the argument from all journals, and I'm rooted out, basically out of this one. Why not? It's a pain in the ass. You think, you may get changes from the people who are with you, but the rest of them who think you're a pain in the ass, they'll close you down. It doesn't matter about the legitimacy, the arguments, or how much you've read, or how well you say it. To go back to process for a minute, what you've done is take the moral high ground, and you've made a judgment where they look like somewhat idiots. Now, you're not going to win that. You're not going to move anybody except just eliminate you. There's no changes to make. Or in fact, the phalanx is harder now than it ever was. So I think, well, critique has got its limits. So I say, are there some other ways around? Because actually, and again, this post-structural move, I don't really have any ground to stand on. There are good arguments in terms of traditions, but they're all deconstructible. There's nothing like fundamental, I have the real logic. I have nothing, I can't do that, even as much as I'd like to. So let me go into the present for a moment. Okay, we're trying to form this qualitative movement. Some of you have been part of this in psychology, because qualitative research has been, not only in the periphery, it's not been allowed. No dissertations in psychology and qualitative research outside of about 3 universities, and they're phenomenological. I'm overstating it, it's roughly the way it is. So, look, there's this whole incredible movement, qualitative on the rest of the social sciences. It's the richest thing that's happened in social science, I think, since inception. Fantastic what's going on today. I credit you with an enormous amount of that. Where is that voice in psychology? Where is that opening and inspirational richness for the rest of the psychology? Nowhere. We work on trying to get a division into the psychology, okay? A new division on qualitative research, which is opposed to empirical. It was set up that way, privately. Severe limitations, the lack of ethics, of foundationalism, and so on of the tradition. And we're set against that, and we have a lot of support from various sources, and we present it to this essentially the governing board of APA, which includes people from all the divisions, and we are voted down. They don't want the division. It's going to ruin the name of science. Because you can, if you're a division member, if you say that this undermines the whole nature of science, you can be let out. And they use my work to justify their critique. So, we have no chance. Now, strangely, very strangely, one of the divisions of the research methods, they've got people that are pragmatists. They kind of do work with industries and so on. They use a lot of qualitative work. They like it. And they haven't thought about science. They haven't thought about epistemology. They don't know about value. They know nothing that Norman knows. They say, well, we ought to have some qualitative. Well, why don't you come and join our division? Now, we're in this strange position. What that division represents and has represented is exactly what we're fighting against. But it will listen for a little bit and let them not just try to eliminate them, but listen to them and say, okay, under some conditions, you might want to measure something that's possible. You might want to use a statistic here or there. It's possible. But listen a little bit and then try to understand it from their perspective so that they can, at least, you're not attacking them, they start listening a little bit. And now we're part of that division, part of APA, has our own journal. That's the other side of that coin. If I don't just resist, and I try to at least get into the world in which these people are living, I find sometimes things can be done. I do resistance. We're having a conference in the middle of the summer, anti-diagnostic. I mean, we're really in a huge critique of the whole DSM and trying to find alternatives to drugs and traditional therapy. And it's a total resistance, and I still embrace it, but I also fear it.
This is like part of your resistance is that of keeping a dialogue going with the other that we are
That's
existing, or the other who's oppressing.
Yeah. Yeah.
There seems to be a link between resisting and performance, of course. Can you unpack that for us? Can you tell us more about what's the link between performance and resistance? And also, perhaps in more specific terms, what can performance do for us when it comes to build on specific issues, such as racism, the issue that you mentioned before? We'll be curious to know your take on this. So how can performance help us to deal with specific issues? Or the performative terms, you want to throw the terms.
Well, it helps us, I think, in multiple ways, but most importantly, I think it underscores the fact that it's always already performative, the phenomenon we're studying. The very thing called race is itself a performance. The very word race is a performance. So to embrace that performance, or to say if there's a performance, certainly is more than to say, well, it's always performative. It's to say it's something that's in motion, that it's ideological, it's contextual, it's elusive, it's processual. The thing is a process. And the best we can do is articulate the structures of that process at a certain level as we make visible the politics of representation that surround it. And by giving, here's a project, I was just talking to Ken and Mary about this earlier today. So I'm working on this a chapter on the Tao Society of Painters. They were created in 1915 and they lasted until 1927. They were located in Taos, New Mexico. They came from the East Coast. They were trained in Europe. They were European trained painters, and they weren't landscape painters. They were trained to paint faces and bodies and landscapes and put people in those bodies. And they came to Taos and they started painting Indians. They started painting Taos Indians, Taos natives. Okay. And they found in these natives this representation, this wonderful sense of Indianness. And it reflected this culture of Taos, the beauty of the region, of the mountains, and the air, and the river, and the nostalgia that's built into the Taos Pueblo itself. You know, it was formed over 1,000 years ago. See, it's a World Heritage Site. They went crazy over it. So they hired these Indians to be models so they could paint them as Indians. And they posed them as 19th century Indians because there was an idiom of painting Indians in the 19th century. You stripped them of their clothing, you gave them loincloths, you gave them bows and arrows, you poised them in nature, or you had them crouched next to a fire, or they were by a stream. Okay, so now we're in 1915 to 1927. We're painting Indians like that. Okay. Now these Indians in Taos, and they're a complex Taos Indian. They're Spanish and they're American and they're Navajo and they're Apache. It's a complicated apparatus, that Indian. But they're being painted as if they were 19th century Indians, right? They could have been painted by George Catlin in the 19th century. Okay. These models, there's about a dozen of the Indians that get paid to be models. Okay, they pick up this trait of being painters. And they start to paint. And their painting is disallowed because they don't paint Indians the way Indians are supposed to be painted. Okay, the galleries won't exhibit them. They can't get people to show their work. So they set up their own galleries. They sell their work in the plaza in Taos. Well, I've written 2 plays on this now with these Taos, these models who became painters who are in dialogue with the painters who painted them. Because the painters who painted them said, you know, they come to work drunk. You can never trust a Taos Indian to be a good model. All they want is a little bit of money. So I'm putting these Indians in play with these painters who are painting them and asking them, they're performing a critique of the hegemonic colonizing apparatus that transformed them into a particular Indian subjectivity that they sold to West Eastern audiences for lots of money. A painting that was just purchased in the Denver Museum of Art for $5 million by one of the TSA painters. So what I'm doing, I'm using this extended example, I'm giving voice to these indigenous painters who started painting the Indians themselves, and who then rose up and offered a critique of the apparatus that painted them. Now, this is me saying it's a futile project. Well, no, it's not a futile project. I think I want to rewrite that. You read the history of painting in Taos, they don't talk about these people. They're not part of that. The official art history of Taos is a straight lineage. From modernism to impressionism to structuralism to cubism to something they call some kind of postmodernism. They're all white painters. George A. Keefe is a good example. They're all white painters. The history of indigenous painting in Taos by indigenous painters is not part of that history. Why not? Well, that's an interesting question. And that's what this project is all about. How you bury one history in the name of another history. So by creating this text or these plays, I'm trying to say, here's a way to crack history and expose a contradiction, performatively. So I'm going to give a voice to these paintings. They didn't write this play. You know, there's very little official record of their voices. There's some notes from their families, from their grandchildren, and from their wives. But I'm constructing a narrative, giving them a voice, and putting them in play with and against this official white discourse. That's what I'm trying to do. That's why I'm using performance performatively in terms of resilience, as one example.
I come at this slightly different way. I mean, I sort of come at it from a constructionist, realizing there's no privileged set of ways of illustrating, describing, explaining the world. And what we've inherited in the academic world is a very specialized language, which is enormously limited in communicating to anybody, and particularly the people who most should be sharing it with them. So we inherit this way of writing in the academy, which is kind of using a dead language for a closed society. But why not open the doors of language to any form of communication possible? And what do? What that does is to make everything that's going on here transparent. We're going to talk about people, share it with them, not behind their back, so that person's crazy, that person's inferior, dysfunctional. But too easy. Secondly, it gives voice to everybody else to join in the dialogue. Like, for example, I have classes now. I can get them to talk and write in the way that I want. That's what I'm paid almost to do, write like an academic. But they've had histories of that. Before they all know how to do that. So I say, all right, this semester, no essays. All I want you to do is to communicate to me something important about what's going on this semester and do it in any other language than academic language. You can write if you want to, write a poem, write a short story, write an essay, autobiography, whatever, or you can use music, you can use dance, you can use photography, you can use anything. And at the end of the semester, we get together for 2 evenings, and this is like dynamite stuff. I mean, I got some kid who's making C's because he can't really write in my language. You give him his own language, he'll move you to tears. It's like he's in his element. And it's fantastic what they can do. So I think what you've done is to close off the elitism of the language. You've opened up what you've got to say to everybody else, and you've given a voice to the society to enter that dialogue in an equally